Okay, we're now recording and we have guests on the line here. You can see we have Nancy. Nancy, where are you from? Nancy, can you hear me? Where are you from, Nancy?
Long Island.
Long Island. Okay, welcome.
Thanks.
President of Long Island. Thank you for being here. Louis, where are you from? Can't hear you, Louis. You're muted. You're muted, Louis.
How is it now?
Perfect.
Okay, yeah. I'm Queens County, closer to the city, part of the city area of Long Island.
Okay, near the city, near New York City and on Long Island. And Louis is our district director. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we have Helmut. Helmut, where are you from?
I'm in Burlington, Ontario.
Burlington, Ontario. Awesome. We have somebody here from Ontario too. And Kathy, where are you from? You're muted, Kathy. You're muted.
Hi, I'm from the Long Island Rose Society, and I live in Valley Stream, New York.
Oh, okay. Say it again, one more time.
Long Island Rose Society, and I live in Valley Stream, New York, on Long Island.
Okay. Long Island Rose Society.
Yes.
Thank you. And Nancy, did we talk to you, Nancy? Oh, that's right. And area code 516. Pat, is that you?
Yep, that's me. I'm Pat Shanley, and I'm in Glen Cove, which is on the north shore of Long Island, and I am with the Manhattan Rose Society and the Long Island Rose Society.
Great. So Pat Shanley, we've seen Pat before. She's helped us at our convention, in fact, a while back. She's with the Manhattan Society as well as the Long Island Society. Welcome.
Thank you.
And
Can I put in a plug for the district convention whenever you think is appropriate?
Sure. So, yeah, we can't hear you, but I'll tell you what, Steve is going to address that in a little bit.
Okay.
Pat. So I think we've got that
fine.
covered. Thank you.
Fine. Yep, go
We
ahead.
appreciate it. All right, then let us, I'm going to bring up Tanya Blankenburg. Tanya is the instructor and curator at the Niagara Parks Botanical Garden and School of Horticulture at the Niagara Falls, Ontario. We had a field trip last year that Tanya hosted, and it was absolutely fabulous. She was kind enough to take us through the gardens at that time, back in September, as I remember. Tanya is very knowledgeable, and we welcome her. So come on forward, Tanya. So you know what you do. Do you want me to bring yours up? Or
Sure, if you want to bring it up.
Absolutely. Let me do that.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, please.
There we go. I'll stand on that side so I don't get blinded by the light.
Okay, and I'll start you up. And okay, Tanya, thank you.
I'll join on this side. So how's everyone tonight? Good. I know some of you have probably been sitting. I was sitting for almost an hour getting here today. So, and I've been on the clock since 7 a.m. So it's been a bit of a long day. So if I get a little silly, it's because it's been a long week already, as we know. So I always like to start with a stretch to get our brains going. So if you can get your arms above your head, or you can put your hands on your hips. Do you know why we do this? Anybody know? This is actually really good for your brain, and this allows you to take risks. And I do this before exams with students to get them a little relaxed. I say ride the roller coaster, but you're supposed to do this for 2 minutes every day before you do anything really important that might be stressful, that's going to put you out of your element. So I know I broke my shoulder. I'm familiar. I can't keep my arms up for too long. So you can do this as well. They're called power moves, and it's really, really good for your brain and how you interact with people. So It's a thing I do when I start my classes before exams. And if you've been sitting for a long time, it kind of gets the blood flowing and gets you going. So for some of you show of hands who joined us last year. There's a couple faces that look familiar. You came for a road trip, and I welcome you to come back again this summer and come see what we do at Niagara Parks. And if you're not familiar with Niagara Parks, if you look across the border, when you go look at Niagara Falls, all of the land from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, we are taking care of. So all of the gardens, there's golf courses, there's attractions. Most people just think of Niagara Falls, but there's a lot of parks and gardens in those sections. If you haven't explored, my information's at the end. If you have questions, feel free at any time to ask. And if you're not familiar with the Niagara Parks Commission, we do have a mandate, and we really look at the fact that we're preserving, we're protecting, and we're inspiring people to get out in nature. Past 4 years, what has happened with a lot of people? Didn't know what to do with themselves because you're at home. So we see a lot of people coming outside. We're seeing a lot of people really interested in gardening. And we are public servants, but most people don't realize that we are fully self-funded. So we don't receive any funding from the Ontario government. We get all of our funding from attractions, parking, golf, restaurants. So it's a misconception that I always hear, oh, you get paid by the government. No, we actually get paid by the people who come and visit us on a regular basis.
Can I pause for a second?
Sure.
Seeing that we're getting element up there. I really want you up there.
Oh,
So let me just make an adjustment. I think I can. Let's see if I
some
can do
music
that.
scrolls through.
Yeah, give me just 1
These are
minute.
floating person. So who's visited Niagara Parks before? Anybody? And as a kid, I grew up coming down to the parkway, riding my bicycle, enjoying all the parks. And we are situated at the Botanical Gardens. And a lot of people always ask us, well, there's a school, right? And we do have a school that's been there since 1936. And it is what was formerly the Apprentice School for Gardeners. And the actual point of the school was to train people to work in the Parks Commission because they had a shortage of gardeners, just like we have a shortage of gardeners now. Nothing has changed since 1936 in that way, but we kind of look at it a little bit differently. So the majority of our students don't end up staying within the Parks Commission after they finish their 3 years. We are a Red Seal trade. I'm not sure in the US you have Red Seal trades that you have to sign off on, write tests for, and we have to as skilled trades. So if you're an electrician, you're a carpenter, you have to finish an apprenticeship, and they spend 36 months with us. When you tell students it's 36 months continuous, their face first goes, yay, it sounds like fun. But 36 months is a long time to spend working out in the garden. So they work side by side with us. We teach them how to be supervisors, how to manage our grounds. And I always tell my students, it's not the actual garden work. It's the actual fact that you have to manage people. And anybody who's managed people before knows how difficult that can get. And now add hot weather, add rain, it snowed yesterday, personalities start to change. So it can be a little bit challenging. So I said, I'm teaching you life lessons as well. So a little bit more about us. We do a lot of work in environmental protection. And this is why I'm talking about how we garden without chemicals. Have some rules set upon us that we cannot grab, weed and feed and throw it on our turf. We have to manage our grounds differently. And anybody who's grown roses knows they can be a little bit challenging. So we have to think about cultural control. And my background in horticulture, I spent 2 years at Niagara College, and I had an opportunity to work for the Horticulture Research Institute of Ontario, which is part of the University of Guelph, which is now Vineland Research. They're one of the rose breeders for the 49th parallel roses. So you may have heard of Canadian Shields, and that was actually commissioned through their research. So I worked there as a student, and I actually worked in peaches, and I have a great love for growing fruits and vegetables, but my job also includes roses. And when I started at Niagara Parks in 2017, they said, here's this massive rose garden, do your thing. And I said, okay. So a little bit overwhelming because if we actually look at what we have in the way of a garden, and this is from American Public Gardens, this is our rose garden. And if you haven't been there, we do have annual beds. So I'm also part of the design of annual beds. I do that with all the students. So everything you see on the grounds is designed and maintained by students. We only have a few
Excuse me.
seasonal staff, but they mainly work On our outlying areas, all of our core collection is taken care of by students. So it's a lot of
Excuse
work
me.
for them to do. On an average day, I have 3 to 4 students that work continuously in the rose garden to maintain edges, keep everything looking nice. We had the question, well, what do you do for weeds? We have to physically scrape and take care of weeds. So there's no spraying weed killer on anything. We cannot damage our soil and we cannot expose anything in the way of chemicals onto our site. So if you take a look from above, we'll talk a little bit more about vistas and how the rose garden was actually designed. But I actually found the original paperwork in our archives of the roses that were selected. And it was in 1940 that this rose garden was put in. And in historical photos, we have interlock brick here now. It used to be basically a soil path. And it was very archaic when they first put it in, but the actual architecture and layout has stayed exactly the same. It's
Tanya,
also-
Tanya,
Yes.
can you focus the camera on the screen so that we who are on Zoom can see what you're talking about?
Okay.
You have to bring it closer. Yeah, I can see it, but it's on this side of my screen.
Okay.
And
Is
I
that a
don't,
little bit
and I-
better?
well, yeah, can you bring it closer? Oh, I don't know if you can or not.
On a table, I'll bring it right to the edge.
Oh, boy.
Whoop.
Okay, let's see what happens now. Oh, a little more green there, but
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, he should be able to see the screen. I'm wondering why he can't.
Maybe he wants me to point out so we can see it. I'm not sure.
No.
He should be able to see the screen.
Yeah, let's pause for a second.
We'll just make sure we can,
You should be able to see right now the picture of the garden, do you not?
I see it behind Tanya right now.
Yeah.
If I say press share screen, would that help?
Oh, of
No.
course,
No.
my
there we
mistake.
go. It's okay.
Come on.
Let's get back to presentation. Okay, so that's better.
Oh, yes,
Saying we're unstable.
thank you. It's
No
beautiful.
problem. There we go.
Let's get the viewer just a speaker.
Yeah, wow.
There we go.
Oh, that's perfect.
Thank
We'll
you.
just slide you up there. And if you have a question, I'll look for hands, so don't hesitate to ask questions. So if you actually look at the design as well, it's like a basin. So if you're standing at the fountain, it's actually dipped in, so everything's ramped, which can make it challenging for airflow, especially on hot days, because this area, especially along the walkways, gets really, really hot. So for the roses that live close to the sides where we have hardscape, it's always been a challenge to make sure that our turf looks nice and that we're not damaging the roses by putting too much water, which we're going to talk about irrigation. So this is all about vistas. And when I show some more slides, you're going to understand a little bit more about our space. Let's see if it will. There we go. So a little bit of history of our site. Our first superintendent, Knut Matthias Froman, was 1936. And this was his vision. He came from Sweden and he was commissioned to design the gardens that we're working in. I'm always good at finding stuff to trip on. So he is our first and founding superintendent. And it was his vision to create gardens with vistas. He also was part of RBG, Royal Botanical Gardens, in the design and layout of their gardens, and has done a lot for public gardens within Canada while he was superintendent. And he's the original designer of this rose garden as well. So our fountain has a dedication plaque, and actually his wife was there when they dedicated the fountain to him. So it was actually quite nice to be able to see that in our history. So looking through historic photos, I love looking back at historical photos of our gardens because there's a lot that goes on. This is our rose garden right here. And you can see this wonderful vista that goes across, that cuts across. And we have several that sit on the ground. So when I stand at the fountain, I can see all the way down to the end of the road, which is several kilometers. Our site for the rose garden is just over 2 acres. Just for the rose garden, our main garden is our core. So we have our rose garden, We have our herb garden and vegetable garden. And it's funny because those are my 3 gardens. I say I get all the showstoppers. I get all the traffic in the core gardens, and then we have outlying, more naturalized areas, which is our weather vane garden on the far side that has a collection of ponds. And then we have an arboretum, and I also have old specimens. This is an old photograph. The trees are much larger now when you walk through those areas. So this is a living classroom, and it's also a botanical garden. So we do have to educate people that come in. I say I treat it like a museum. You don't climb the trees. You don't go and, behind the velvet rope at the Mona Lisa and go touch. I said, this is part of our classrooms. So it's nice to see the wonderful vistas that we have. We're doing a lot of upgrades and changes coming in the weeks and months to come. So don't be shy, come and visit us and see all the different changes that are going to be happening. But I was reassured they're not going to change anything in the rose garden in the way of the architecture. It is one of the largest rose gardens in North America. We have quite a few roses, and I regularly have to go out and count. We have 52 beds. So when we looked at this in a real-time photograph, this is one of my working CAD maps that I work with, because I also have to think about color. It's beyond just the roses that we use. So we only have hybrid tea, grandiflora, and floribunda in our center collections. They're all keyed by numbers, and they're color coded, so everything matches. So if I have a yellow on the left, I need a yellow on the right. So when I'm selecting new plants, besides having only 3 types to pick from interiors, I also have to match the color as good as I can, because our director is a stickler when it comes to that. He wants to make sure that we stay true to what was laid out. So it is easier than it was a few years back. We're seeing a lot more new rose varieties, a lot of hardy resistant roses, so it's quite nice. Where we've had some issues is on our outlying areas, because the trees, when they originally planted, were very small, and now they're creating a lot of shade. So some of our climbers are starting to struggle. We're having some issues. At our pergola, I went through 2 years ago when I replaced those. I went to David Austin climbers because they are better performing than what was sitting there. We had a lot of black spot, and we were dealing with a lot of issues. So they're just starting to fill the space. We just redid the back screen of it, so it actually looks absolutely beautiful. Our original pergola was put in 1980, and I had some historical photos that I found because recently someone thought it was a great idea to come peel the copper off the roof. So we have dealt with a lot of vandalism through COVID, which has been very frustrating, and it's happened twice now. So I said, next I'll just put aluminum foil up, because I feel like we're going to run out of stuff to put on there. So it has been a challenge for us, but we want to stay true to what was in our original rose garden. So I have 52 display beds. On average, depending on how many beds get replaced per year, I have anywhere between 2,300 and 2,500 roses just in the interior collection, not including border and climber issues that I have. So what we're doing also is we're replacing some of those climbers in some areas with the shrub roses with perennials, because we're seeing the fact that we have a bit too much shade, and we don't want to put the roses into stress. Because what happens when we're stressed? You get sick, right? Same thing happens to our plants. So if we're not respecting what they need, we're going to end up with issues. So we work with a lot of maps that keep everything. This is all of our records. Everything is accessioned, meaning it has a number assigned to it. I can go up to the tag. I can tell you when it was planted and the number associated. I can put it into our program, and it tells me everywhere it's been on the grounds, including the day it arrived, where it went to, and all the places that it's been. If a rose dies, I have to put it into the record and to say that this rose bed has been decommissioned, and I go on to my next steps. So there's a lot of records that I have to keep as part of my job. And that's basically, as a curator, just like a museum, I have to keep my collection, but it's a living collection. So anything that's permanent on our grounds, meaning that it's perennial, shrub, or tree, everything is listed and cataloged for us. So we have to go through and do that. Okay, so this is where the challenge came in. We had a pesticide ban. And what does that mean? You're laughing. What does it mean for us?
No miticide, no fungicide, no herbicide.
Nothing. So if I go to TSC here, it's like, oh, look at all this stuff, and I cannot take it across the border. So if you are a homeowner or a public garden space, a municipality, you cannot use anything that falls under cosmetic ban. And I can tell you the list is really long. So
Even a homeowner?
no, you can actually report your neighbors for using
Oh.
Roundup
Ooh.
or using bean feed. But I joke that I walk around in the neighborhood in the evening and I'm like, oh, I can smell Roundup. We're technically only supposed to use it for poison ivy. I know people have poison ivy everywhere, but we deal with an issue with we cannot spray on the roses. So when I was hired in 2017, I was joking with Steve at dinner and I said, you know what? There was a lot of people that had always done things the same way. And I said, that's kind of a dangerous situation to get into, to always think this is the way we've always done it. And why can't we change anything? Because you can't see the forest for the trees. So I was that spitfire person who came in and said, show me your irrigation, show me what you're doing with your soil. Let's look at our rose varieties, and started to really dig in and figure out what we could do to make this a better rose garden. We had a lot of roses that are getting older. You guys saw that when you came for the tour. We do have quite a few, like I say, in palliative care on their way out, but we don't have replacements because of course we have budget limitations just like every organization. So I have to play my cards correctly to make sure I can get through and slowly replace roses. So all of the rose beds that you see, we do annual displays as well. So we have our spring display, which right now we've switched all to daffodils because we have an amazing amount of deer on our property. And I have full collections of antlers that I've gotten because they dig the bulbs out. So we have completely switched to daffodils because they don't touch them. But they will come and eat the roses as well. So I have to fence off the rose garden. So if you do come, we do have a fence around it. We're looking at doing a permanent fence on the whole property to kind of push them out. But the issue is that we have so many. We said it's like a petting zoo. They come in the evening, they wait for us to get in our cars, and we have to deal with this. So we really have to look at our cultivars. We have to think about how we work through, because we have lots of seasonal change, lots of different plants that come in, and then we still have to manage all of these rose beds. So the biggest issue with our older varieties is they really lack disease resistance. So we have to look at our big players, and of course, black spot is our worst offender, and anybody in roses really knows it's a make it or break it. You look at a lot of older roses, and I talk with rose growers. I work with Backer's Nursery in St. Catharines, 3 generations of rose growers, probably one of the largest rose growers in Canada. And he said to me too, he goes, do you know what? Every 10 years, you'd be looking at replacing beds, in the way of, if you keep a cultivar for 10 years, if it performs well, yes, you can keep it after that. You're going to switch it out for something else, because you're trying to educate the public, showing them that you can still grow roses without having to struggle. Some of these roses have been in the ground since the late 70s. I tease my students. I'm like, I was just a toddler when those were in the ground and you weren't even a thought. So we laugh about that. We also deal with things like powdery mildew, rust, and rose mosaic virus. So we really have to look at, and I'm going to show you some of the things that we do on the front end and on the back end, how we control these. Any questions so far? At any point, if you have a question, just throw your hand up. I don't get distracted by questions. So I use this picture because this is how it used to be, right? And I find it interesting because we're out here dusting, and what is he missing?
Mask.
I'm a stickler for safety, and when I see that kind of stuff, it just kind of makes me shudder, because this is how we used to go ahead and care for our roses. I hear stories of the roses were this tall and they bloomed for months on end. I'm like, no, you look at pictures, they're not that tall. They're still the same height. I said everything looks better in the past, but we have to think about moving forward, how we actually look through our roses and how we maintain them. So I had fun looking at our rose garden and thinking about all the things that we do. And this was last spring. Came through and did a panoramic after we unhilled and pruned our roses, and kind of really thought about some of the things that I go through every single day when we plant. So when I went through and did this lecture, I thought about, what do I do on a regular basis? Tell me about the seasons, and how do we work through all the different things that we do on our site. And some of my favorites, I honestly think this is my favorite rose. This is Poseidon. I love purple, and purple is my favorite color. And when people walk through the garden, they ask, what's your favorite rose? I'm like, Poseidon. And my second favorite is Pretty Lady. It does really, really well in our grounds. We see people constantly running over to take pictures. And this is actually Alina, which is on the finishing end, so it gets a little bit yellow. And I do love yellow roses as well. So showcase some of my favorites. I can say that Poseidon is probably the best rose that I've ever worked with in the way of black spot rating. We do ratings from 1 to 10, and some of our old varieties get up to 7 and 8, meaning that I have 75 to 80% defoliation at the end of the season.
Wow.
Poseidon, I'm lucky if I give it a 2. So I go through once a month and I rate my roses so I can actually catalog and look at them. And I have 15 years of data looking at all cultivars. So if you ever have a question, hey, I'm really interested in this rose, how does it perform? Just send me a message and I can help you out. Because we've shifted and changed a lot of our roses for that reason and how they perform. So this isn't new news that roses are grafted, and this is what makes them challenging. And I do teach a propagation course and explain to students that we do have a different rootstock. And in the past, you had the question about rose replant. The issue is we were using wild roses as the rootstock. And what's the problem with wild roses besides the spreading of fun diseases? It is really aggressive, okay? Really, really aggressive rootstock. And this happens a lot in the nursery industry. We pick rootstocks that we pick them for hardiness, we pick them for disease resistance, and the fact that they're aggressive and fill that space. But the problem with aggression is this right here. Suckers and shoots. So some of our old varieties do sucker quite a bit. We don't use wild rose anymore, and it's not customary in the industry anymore. But that was the go-to for a long time. And this is why we had a lot of issues. This is why we dealt with a lot of virus as well. We also think about having to cover this. So at this time of the year, we just finished 2 weeks ago doing our unhilling. So we went through and unhilled because we want to open up this actual union. And there is a changing mindset in this. I was talking to Steve about, we had a rose that we tested out and we buried it deeper last year to see if we would actually have to hill or unhill. Your weather is not much different than what we have on the other side of the border. And we get that freeze thaw cycle. So that freeze thaw cycle is really the detriment to our budding union and causes a lot of issues because that freeze thaw, that water will actually burst cells and then we run into trouble. So we want to make sure that we cover it. So we actually planted the roses deeper, and I was happy to report because every week I would go out in the winter and poke around and look through my fingers to make sure it was still alive. And it was still green. I was actually quite surprised. And some of our weaker roses as well were still green above their hills. So our winter was kind to us. So we're seeing that now that we have some bigger roses. Some of our yellow varieties that have struggled are doing very well this spring. So winter helped us, but we're looking at all our replacements to start planting them deeper so we don't have to hill as much. Who likes hilling roses? Nobody put their hand up, see? Hill 2,500 roses. We form a chain gang, as I joke, we're out there. And we're out there for days and days and days going through and hilling. And it's labor intensive, it's hard on your back, and it can be hard on the roses as well. Because a lot of the roots, when we go in and hill, what do we end up doing? We split them and then encourages them to sucker. So by planting them deeper, we're hoping we're going to get away from some of that. And we are starting to see with our newer varieties, we don't even have to hill as much anymore because they're just much stronger
a little bit.
to resist.
Just a minute.
So our favorite thing, unhilling, we just went through and did this. And I just grabbed the photograph just to show you. This is often what's left behind when we start to unhill. We go through and we use tools because we have so many roses to unhill. If I had, 5 or 10, you can meticulously get in there with your gloves and pull it apart. We end up taking a Dutch hoe, loosening the soil, and we use a baton, which is a fancy way of saying we have a stick. And we go through, loosen the soil, and then we use a blower just to open that area up. We make sure in the fall that we get rid of all of the leaf debris, so there's very little that's sitting there. And we actually have been leaving the mulch, because something that was done in the past was all the mulch in the fall was pulled off the beds because black spot. And my train of thought is if the soil is healthy and constantly breaking down, we're going to help break that black spot down. Those microbes they need all that carbon. If we take all that carbon away every single time and then have to put it back on in the spring, it's very labor intensive and we're actually stripping the soil. So it gives a little bit more insulation to the plants. When we've hilled, we just pull the mulch apart, pull our soil, and then pull the mulch over. So it creates extra insulation in the breakdown process. So we're careful not to damage the plants, and that's why we're using the blowers more than we are sitting there scraping, because before people were hitting roses, we end up nicking, we allow diseases to enter, and it allowed us to be more efficient in our time, because that's an awful lot of roses for us to go through. We have to make sure that our tools stay clean, and Madeline had a question.
Yeah, just really quick.
Oh.
How often do you put new mulch on the beds, and
Once a year.
what kind of mulch do you use?
We use a pine mulch.
Okay.
Actually, one of our donors, we receive some donations from alumni. We have a soil blender that's north of Toronto. Actually, my mulch is coming next week. So after we've unhilled and gone through our leveling process, you may notice our edges, we call them chocolate bars. And I always joke to the students, if you fall, you should be able to cut your face on the bed. It's so sharp. We then put mulch over top of it to make sure that we can retain moisture. So once a year we put mulch on. Some of the beds we use less mulch because they're very thick, and we want to make sure that we're not putting too much carbon onto the bed. So on average about 4 inches of mulch around. We make sure that we're not covering those unions, that we're not causing too much buildup of moisture around the base of the rose. Roses like to be a little on the dry side, and we often give them too much love. I always use the example, if someone said to you, hey, you need something to drink, I'll bring it to you. And then you say, I'm hungry. Well, I'll bring it to you. What happens over time? We get dependent, and we have to watch that with our plants too. So we try to encourage them to fend for themselves a little bit without causing stress. So there's a fine balance when we go through and do that. Did you have a question?
Oh, no, I was just pointing.
Okay, sorry, I saw your hand come up. It's important that everything is kept clean. So with having so many beds and so many roses to go through, every time we switch beds, you have to go through and sanitize your tools. So we have to be very, very careful. So all of our material is sanitized. We use a product called Coverage, which is basically a greenhouse disinfectant. And we have spray bottles out in the field that we're using all the time. So all of our tools are disinfected before we come out. Every time you switch a bed, you have to disinfect. And then once you put your tools away, the same thing happens. So we have to be very meticulous. I always remind students too, even if you can in the evening, spray your shoes off, because you're stepping in bed after bed after bed. Makes it a little bit harder. We do have to be careful if you're bending over. I always remind, I wear glasses, so I don't think about it. But if you bend over, it's very easy to get scratched. And we want to be careful that we're not causing any issues to our skin and all of that fun stuff. So when do we complete this? For us, we go through end of March is usually our set time to unhill. We have to be very careful and mindful because we have a lot of gardens to get through. And we take all of our students as first years. They get the full experience. I say they hill everything and they unhill everything, so they understand the process from start to finish. End of March, usually our weather is favorable. Sometimes we have to push to the start of April. We were pretty good this year. We got through at the end of March, got everything unhilled, and we're able to do everything in unison. So after we unhill, we go through and we do our prunings. We do workshops on our site where students basically get immersed in what they're doing. So they get to practice and practice and practice. So going through and doing so many. I also apply fertilizer at this point. I like to use a 10-10-10 slow release. It allows the roses to get a little bit, pumped up and ready for the season without getting them growing too fast. Because what happens when our temperature drops in new growth? There's a good chance I can lose it. So I don't want to pump too much. So 10-10-10, I like slow release fertilizer. Some people like to do liquid, but the issue is if the soil is cold, where does the fertilizer go? Gone. Okay, you might as well just take the money and throw it away. So using a slow release, brands like Osmocote, things like that. I'm not promoting one over another. We use all different brands of slow release fertilizers on our site, but using Osmocote as an example, it will only release when the temperature is correct and when the moisture level is correct. So if it's too dry, you're not going to burn your plants. If it's too wet, they're not going to open up too fast and saturate the soil with fertilizer. It's more cost effective, I find, you're spending more on liquid fertilizer because you're spending more time out there doing it. So being able to go through, I can do all 52 beds of fertilizer in less than 2 hours. And it allows me just to keep walking, and I fertilize everything in 2 hours. So it doesn't take long. That's a lot of acreage to walk, but you can get through it pretty quick because you know you're not going to be doing that constantly. So after we unpill, we go through and do that because we want to make sure that we can give them a little bit of a head start, because the spring can be a little bit difficult depending on our weather fluctuations. Yes. We can't use things like bone or blood meal. We get complaints from people if we use blood meal because of the smell. We also have animals. So we do have coyotes on our site, as well as skunks, raccoons, squirrels. It's like Cinderella some days. So we have to be very careful with what we add. I do end up using Epsom salts and add that into the soil, and I spray it onto the plants as well. Once they start leafing out, it allows for color and it allows for some disease resistance as well. So it kind of pumps them up without using fertilizer. We have to be very, very careful with organics because of the fact that if we're spraying, everything has to be listed, even if it's an organic, and we have to call in, post, and then we have to close areas, so it can be very challenging. I work more with soil health when I do applying different sprays, because it can also get super expensive for us. With that many roses to go through, it takes hours to spray, and it gets very expensive to use that much product. At home, I use things like blood meal and bone meal. I just have to keep it away from the dog, otherwise it tastes really good, so we have to be very careful. So we're really aware of what we go through. This is one of our wonderful yellows. This is Julia Child. It's a very challenging bed to work in because the rose does intertwine. It's a very aggressive yellow rose, so if you are looking for a nice yellow, Julia Child, I said she was a tough lady, and she really produced a tough rose as well. So probably one of my favorite yellows as well. Anyone have this one in their garden? Yeah, I love it. I love it. And it's a beautiful one. It performs really, really well long-term. And again, black spot rating, it's quite low on the scale for me every year. So good pick. Okay, so we have to look through all of our tools. We use a wide variety of tools because we often run into some of our grandiflora and floribunda have some really big canes. I say if it's bigger than your thumb, don't use your secateurs because you'll end up damaging them. So you have to go through with loppers. So we have a whole arsenal of tools when we go through. We travel bed to bed, and we really have to keep things clean. There is a cautionary tale. Has anyone ever got poked by a rose thorn? Oh, yeah. And then the next day, what happens? Has anyone ever had an infection from a rose cane or a rose thorn? It's not pleasant. Okay, so if you deal with things like roses, sphagnum moss, or hay, there is a chance for blood poisoning. You have to be very careful. I know you don't think about it. You work in your garden all the time. My favorite time is working at home because I don't have to wear gloves. And if you actually get poked by a thorn overnight, what happens is you suddenly can't bend your finger and it will get really red and swollen. If that ever happens, please, please, please get medical attention, because that is the start of blood poisoning. I had a student in 3 years who got it. Chances. I'm like, I've never had it happen to me, but it was actually a little bit of a cautionary tale. Anytime you are working, it's called the rose gardener's disease. It's spread by a fungus, and it will enter your bloodstream quite quickly. So if you do end up working without gloves, you get scratched or you get a thorn, especially embedded in your finger, take it out, disinfect your finger, and just observe it. So if you notice that it starts getting hot, it's usually within 12 hours, it can get very uncomfortable and it is dangerous. So yes, gardening is a dangerous activity. You have to be careful. So I always say when I work with students, make sure you disinfect your hands. Afterwards, make sure you wash your hands properly, because there's a lot of funguses out there that can cause issues. But working in roses, this is my cautionary tale, because like I said, 3 times in 3 years, I'm like, I don't think this.
Keep your tetanus shots up to date.
Yes, that is another one. Keep your tetanus shots up to date, because no one likes lockjaw. Okay, so we think about pruning, and I think about pruning being increasing vigor, because I'm basically rejuvenating the plants. We're going through a lot of our garden spaces now to wake up And I'm promoting structure. And I tell students, you are creating the architecture for that season for the rose. So I use the hand method. And I always joke, you have 5 fingers, most of us, right? If we didn't have a pruning accident. So I always look at my hand, and if I hold my hand in the shape of my hand, I can see that I have a big open space in the middle. That's going to create airflow for me. That's going to allow those plants to resist some problems that may come later. Because what happens later in the summer is that our relative humidity climbs at nighttime, and we end up getting leaf wetness. So if we have more airflow, and you're not in a basin of a garden, it can be a little bit easier. So it also eliminates tangled growth because we do have a lot of wind on our site too. So if you have anything crossing, my rule of thumb is dead, diseased, damaged, or intersecting. So if it's intersecting, it might rub. That rubbing is going to end up causing issues. So I want to avoid it. I'm trying to predict how the rose is going to grow and how it's going to space out. So there's your hand, and we want to reduce our canes. We have our set for hybrid tea. We like to pick 3 to 5 canes, but I always joke to students, I will still sleep at night if you have 6 beautiful canes, but we try to reduce because some of the older roses will shoot a lot of stems in the spring, and I don't want that cluttered environment. When we go through grandiflora and floribunda are 5 to 7 canes that we want to keep after we unhill. We want to make sure that we get rid of anything that is diseased, damaged, doesn't look nice, growing the wrong way, and we're trying to pick the strongest canes to produce the nicest show. It's different than a homeowner's garden. We're constantly providing a show, and someone's going to realize when they go in, they see a rose that they don't like, they'll be like, oh, that one looks terrible. What'd you do? They never point out the ones they love. They always point out the ones that they don't. So I always joke, make them all look nice. So this is one of our roses. This is Canada Blooms, and it is a newer variety on the market. And it's a beautiful pink rose. I'm happy that they're breeding a lot more scented roses. We went through a phase where there were no scented roses, and you'd go up and you go smell a rose and it didn't smell like anything. A lot of people didn't pick those because of insects, which I'll talk about later. But the issue is that when you look at a rose, you walk up to it, you want it to smell like a rose. So Canada Blooms is a really nice pink. If you haven't seen it before, it behaves really well, has good black spot rating. And as you can see, it's a very vigorous rose. And what do we notice about all the canes? It's super, super crowded. Okay, so I want to make sure, first off, I tell the students, go in and remove everything dead. Anything that you see dead, remove it. If you're cutting it back and you notice that it's brown, and then you notice that it's starting to turn a little bit white, keep going. Let's see where we're at. But a lot of times you have to determine this is dead. Let's take it out. It's going to cause clutter. So I go into the center and I open up that center right away. I'm looking at the architecture. I'm not thinking about height yet. And I had my student Ben come through and I said, you're my Vanna White. Go through and you prune and I'll take pictures. Ooh.
Let's fix that.
We're running out of batteries. We're gonna have to pedal soon.
Let's fix that. Okay.
We might have to plug back in.
Yeah, do you know where the cord went? It's right here.
Right there. So we want to expose the crown, and we want to use a few cracks and broken pieces. That happens throughout the winter because we get a lot of air movement in there. If you've been in our rose garden in the winter, it's quite windy, and we do get some snow loads, so we have to watch because some of them will start to get damaged. When we go through in the fall, we do a clear cut to the knee height, and then after we just hill from there. So anything that's sitting above, I'm not too worried about, and we want to go through and clean. And as you can see going through, there was an awful lot in there, and he's getting to the point where he's reduced and started to decide which canes he's going to go further to prune. So I always prune at a 45-degree angle. Anybody know why we do that? So water doesn't sit on top. It allows us to drain constantly. So it's going to go through, and I go to the upper outmost, and I start to think about how is that cane going to grow. So if it's pointed inwards, and I explain to students, if I'm picking this bud here that's pointing in, that means I'm going to cause more clutter in the center of the row. So I'm always thinking about my hand. I'm always thinking about how it's going to grow outward. so I can create the massive amount of airflow that I'm going to need. I try to remove anything that is smaller than my pinky finger. Some of our older roses, I can't really do that because I'd have no canes left. But in our bigger ones, I like the larger canes. They're going to produce more. They're going to be stronger. Why waste your energy on the small stuff? Okay, so I go through, I only leave about a 1/4 inch above that bud. I don't want to leave a lot up there. So what's going to happen is that's going to die back. There's a chance disease is going to enter that. It can also kill the whole cane. So I want to be careful that I go through. And when I cut down, I have to think about suckers. Okay, so I always watch people take succators and cut them. No, 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 dig it out, pull it out. Okay, so do a twist and pull it. It will actually discourage more suckers from coming. If you actually take your succators and go through and snip this sucker, it's kind of like an octopus tentacle and just more will start popping up and then it becomes very difficult. With the older roses, this is really challenging. So you actually have to dig out that crown and go through and pull. So never, ever, ever cut them, always rip them. So looking at our rose, this is what I have left behind. You can see that it's green all the way through. I like to cut down a little bit further to make sure that I actually have green, healthy cane that's going to produce something. If it's partially white, it's not going to do anything. There's a chance it could die off. And with 2,500 roses, I don't have time to go back and prune them one more time. It's a one-shot deal. You walk around the bed, take a look, make sure everything's okay, move on to the next. So there's an awful lot to get through. We have to be very, very careful to get to our next steps. So my fertilizer, I have a very set schedule that I go through. We're going to be doing our first application coming in May. I only do May, June, and July. I do not like to fertilize trees, shrubs, anything past the end of July, because that fleshy growth, you get cold temperatures in September, October, you're just going to be dealing with dead material. You're also putting a lot of growth at a time that you're not going to have a lot of activity. Our flush is Father's Day and September. And if I fertilize in September, I'm going to cause issues further in the season. It's also not cost effective. We love to use fertilizer. You see the trucks driving around right now, fertilizing people's lawns. And I'm like, you might as well light the money on fire. It's not actually helping your turf. So same thing with roses. If we put it on too early, not going to do anything. I use slow release. I use 18, 18, 18. The brand we use for that is a Clark, and it's an agricultural brand fertilizer. We buy it by the pallets because we go through so much fertilizer on our site. So it is quite a bit, but we have to think about how the plants grow and how we're going to actually produce the most for us. Since June is a flourishing month for us, we'll have roses blooming from mid-June, and some of them start as early at the beginning of June. This season might be a little bit off because we've had warm weather and they're a little bit further ahead. We just have about this much growth on our canes right now in the way of the shoots. So I can tell you in a couple weeks, we're going to have buds forming and it's going to get exciting. But if we get cold temperature, it slows things down. But I want to make sure I'm not wasting fertilizer and not wasting resources and over fertilizing, because this is something that we do a lot of. We get a lot of fleshy growth. What else are you fertilizing when you're fertilizing your beds? Weeds. Okay, so we don't want to create competition and more work for us. So at this time of the year, we're really making sure that our beds are weed free, so we're not causing issues down the road. And this is our vegetable garden. And the reason I use this picture is we have wonderful overhead irrigation. And so you say overhead irrigation and roses, and what does your face do? Yeah, cringe. Okay, so we use a really old system on our site. It's called the Buckner system, and there's only one company that makes replacement parts, and it's in Fresno, California. We only have 2 sites in Ontario that use this system. It's an underground system of connected networks where we plug what are called keys, and you plug your guns in. So there's actually high pressure water that we connect. And the comment about organics, we actually get some organics through our water because we have a canal behind us that collects all sorts of wonderful things. So we have untreated water that we spray on all of our crops because it's inexpensive and readily available for us. So we do get some organics through. I don't run through the sprinklers. Because it's like, who wants pink eye? So it does add some extra minerals, a bit high on the iron side, which does help us. Our pH can be challenging for us. So on average, we sit between 6.8 and about 7.5. As
Yeah.
the season goes on, we can go up to 8 because we're on limestone. So that limestone, we never have to lime our soil in Ontario because Southern Ontario is sitting on limestone. That's why when you get in the shower, you have that little crust on your shower head. That's your calcium carbonate. We don't have to add that. So what happens over the season is your pH will start to climb. If you're using city water, it's treated. So they're adding things like chlorine to adjust the pH and keep it clean. We don't have that with natural water. So this water tends to run high on the pH. So I have to be very careful in how I interact with it. The other issue is what happens when we put water onto roses like this. Black spot, okay? Leaf wetness. It's okay to water your roses, but when do you have to water them? Earlier in the afternoon. And I almost had a heart attack. I'm like, what are we doing? Well, that's how we've always done it. I'm like, no. So I started programming. I have 10 programs that run through my garden. And I run them from 3 o'clock on. So water pressure, if you come to the ground really early in the morning, you come have a shower because the water runs from early. And I only use it during drought or new plant material. The other time we water is when it's raining because everything's already getting soaked. Then we go ahead and soak our turf at the same time because you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound, it's already raining. So you might as well add the water at that point. But otherwise, I'm not irrigating my roses heavily. New roses, yes, I will give them an inch of water, but I will go and actually just spray the bed. I won't spray the actual roses because I don't want to enjoy more black spot than we already deal with. So irrigation is a really tricky thing we have to work with. Like I said, we have an older system. It is high pressure water. If you get sprayed by this, it actually can hurt because the pressure is so strong. The keys, when we plug them in, if a key slips, it will bounce about this high off the ground. So when I do safety, you never lean over top because otherwise you could break your sternum. The pressure that we have because they're industrial pumps that we go through and have to use. So just want to show you how they spread and spray. And that's one of my other collections. And this was early spring, is my vegetable collection. So vegetables were a lot easier to maintain in the way of we can spray them with water. Roses, we have to look at them a little bit differently. So less is more, and I try to avoid overhead as much as possible, water around the base of the plants. Older plantings, what's challenging for us is we have annual plants mixed in. So we have annuals that are set down our borders, set down our main pathways. So we go ahead and water the annuals almost daily, but we can't do that with the roses. So we had to change how we actually go through and water. And as you can see, we have these wonderful roses. This was in June of last year, trying to fill that space, but I can't constantly water. And I have to be aware that I also have turf that I have to keep green. So it can be a real balancing act. So like I said, when it rains, we turn on our irrigation because the water's already flowing. We might as well go with it. So less is more, and I try to really limit. So we do deal with issues with diseases, and I'm going to share some different things that we work on just for management and cultural control, things that you can do in your own home, things that you can do in larger sites as well. But these are our main 4 that we run into at our site. I know there's some other bothersome things that we've run into, but these are our main 4 triggers that we have to deal with, and I'm constantly looking at and constantly balancing. And of course, our favorite, black spot. And as you can see, black spot, our wonderful friend. It can overwinter in canes too, and we're seeing it in some of our older varieties. That's why we have to really prune them back hard or remove the cane completely. And as you know, it lives in the soil. So this is where soil health really comes in, because actively composting soil is also breaking down diseases. Okay, so it's breaking down those diseases because of temperature. So how microbes operate, and we always think worms. I always laugh because people are like, oh, I'll just feed my worms. Actually, the worms are attracted to that bacteria and fungus that is growing on leaves. And that's what gets them to eat them. It's not actually what they're eating. They're attracted to what's on it. So it's kind of a weird balancing act. I love composting. It's a big thing that I'm part of, and I actively help at the parks manage our site for composting. We do create our own compost that we add back into the beds as well, that we screen and filter at many of our different sites. Reduce the amount of waste we put out. So the issue is the spores spread into the canopy and they end up splashing. Older varieties being less resistant, we have to look at overall quality of the rose and how they perform. So this is why I interact with different groups to see what they suggest. I go to different sites to see how the roses perform and work with different people in research that are actually looking at breeding more resistant hardy roses. Okay, so I really want to be careful with any plant you want to clean up in the fall. We have to go through and make sure that we don't leave leaves behind. Also removal of canes. So be very careful when you're pruning that you're taking this material out. Anything that we remove from rose beds, where do we put it? Do not put it in the compost, okay? You can spread problems to other people. In Ontario, we have a commercial green bin system. You could put it to the curb with your garbage and trash. I don't know if you have that here. And we can compost and it goes somewhere else. But I discourage people from doing that because if the temperatures aren't managed properly, can cause issues. So what should you do with all your rose material? Have a little campfire, okay? So get rid of it because that's your best bet for any of your waste. Anything that might fall on the ground like spores, you're actively composting, you're adding mulch, you're cultivating your beds, so you're turning and activating and aerating your soil. It's going to help break down this. So healthy soil can help your plants. When we're constantly taking everything away from it, stripping it, causing the plant stress, that's when we're going to run into issues. We want to keep our soil healthy. Question?
Is like cow manure or horse manure part of your?
No, the issue with animals, and we talk about this in class quite a bit, is depending on the animal, they consume differently. So I have horses and grew up with horses. And if you've ever watched a horse eat, they're not very efficient. They're usually very fast and they chew their food way too quickly. And what goes in often comes out as the food that went in. Okay, so it doesn't spend enough time in their digestion. So what are you often bringing out the other side is weed seeds. Then you have to watch for animals with multiple stomachs. So you get into sheep and cows and they carry E. coli. So there is a great chance that if you work with animal manures that you are exposed to potential pathogens that can make you sick. If you're buying it from commercial sources, it's been sitting in bags for a long time. So it's basically broken down. There's not much left in it. And if it's in a plastic bag, it's been solarized. So if you're breaking it down yourself, you do have to heat it to proper temperatures. You do have to get to 65 degrees Celsius for a minimum of 3 days. And sorry, Canadian rules, I have to calculate what that would be in Fahrenheit. You're basically cooking out any pathogens without getting too hot that you're taking the microbes. So I always say that all manure is not created equal. If you get into chicken manure, really high nitrogen, causes hot compost, can burn your plants. So I tend not to use animal manures. I'm using plant waste. In my home garden, I basically have this beautiful container that sits on my counter. And when people come over, they're like, oh, look at that beautiful pottery. I'm like, well, that's my compost. So everything goes into my compost that I'm prepping for dinner. So any vegetable, any scraps from the kitchen that way, no meat, no fat, no oils or anything like that. And it goes out into my compost. I have a vermicompost. So it's constantly breaking down and I actually bring stuff back to work and use it on other sites. So I'll create teas to actually go through if I'm dealing with an issue in a small scale. In a large scale, we're just much too large to be able to deal with that for acres of space. So choose your animal manure wisely because they don't all process their food the same way. There's also an issue with potential, if they're being exposed to any medications, that medication can travel through, especially in commercial settings. So that can end up back in your manure source as well. So I always say, get to know your farmer. I laugh because my dad always goes to the farm and he's probably there today picking up horse manure. And my mom gets mad at him because the dog will eat it. And then there's all that. So there's a process with that, but we have to be careful because of pathogens. And a lot of it really isn't as nutrient rich. You're better off to go vermicomposting. You're going to get much more bang for your buck. And there's a lot, yes, yuck factor that goes with it as well. So if you want to learn about vermicomposting, I can spend days on that.
What is it called?
Vermicomposting. So you're using actual worms to break down your material. And they actually will release and unlock micronutrients that are in the soil to create a super soil. It's hydrophobic. It does need to be blended. So you end up blending it with a topsoil or just add it into your garden space. If you actually handle it, it doesn't smell, and it smells, when you smell it, kind of smells earthy, like you're smelling beets, and it has a texture of coffee grounds that are dark dry. So basically a worm will process, just like a bird has a gizzard, a worm also has a gizzard and will chew and break down that material. So all the leaf litter that you keep, I'm that person who steals their neighbor's leaves, putting it in my compost. I actually admitted to my neighbor I was taking her leaves. I bring her bags back to her because I was using so many leaves in my compost. So it's probably your best bet. And leaves are filled with micronutrients. So they go up into the tree, they're growing all season, and they fall under the tree for a reason. And we often not do our trees the best respect by taking all the leaves away. They're providing their own fertilizer. I always joke because I take all my leaves and I put them in my flower beds, and I've had people walk by and I had a gentleman get angry with me. Well, you should be taking them out. I said, why? I said, do the squirrels rake the forest? And he's like, no. I said, where do all the leaves go then? I said, I never have to add mulch. So I can maintain things differently at home, but when I do display gardens, I have to watch with how much leaf litter and leaf mold I leave behind, because there's an education factor as well. So we do create our own leaf molds that we use in our annual beds to create more organic matter as well.
Is it mostly oak leaves that you use?
No, we only have a few large oaks in our collection. We have a lot of maple and mixed deciduous shrubs. We try to avoid oak because of the strong callus. It does have to be mowed several times, and it can be acidic. So depending on the region that you live in, you don't want to add too much to your garden because it can change your pH. So this is our wonderful rose. When you walk out, what do we see? Lesions, right? And with lesions also comes defoliation. Okay, so over time, the plant will start to weaken. It starts to shed leaves, and I say they become bare on the bottom. So we actually rate them with how much leaf mass they will keep as the season goes on. Some of our better performers, you barely even notice if there's any black spot because there's no leaf litter. Usually your first sign that black spot is becoming a problem besides the speckles is you'll start to see litter around the base of the plant. So if you can at that point, go through and remove that, because every time you water again, it just keeps splashing up. In your older varieties, you may notice more and more that starts to build up, which can become an issue. So we try to stay on top of that as we go through. We're constantly monitoring. You'll see me walking around looking at and assessing the roses to see where we're at. This is long-term because we have to go through and look at displays and replacements as we go through. Powdery mildew is another issue that we deal with because of the shape of our garden. Since it's a bowl shape, it actually prevents the airflow in the summer. It gets very hot. It can get very stagnant. Outlying areas has a lot of big trees and can stop it. In the winter, it is like a wind tunnel. In the summer, it's like an oven. Okay, so we have to really watch. We tend to see this later in the season. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with relative humidity, but when you go outside in the evening in the summer, you notice that it kind of gets hot and sticky. And as the night goes on, your relative humidity is climbing. So what happens within plants, as we know that plants are constantly transpiring until it gets too hot. And late in the day, we have the stomata close underneath. So under the leaf, basically, that's where all of the exchange happens. And when the plant starts to shut those off, when it gets too high in relative humidity, we start to see a buildup of moisture because it's not actually transpiring to the environment anymore. So we have nighttime leaf wetness. We have to really think about what can happen. So soil health does help us because the plants are actively growing and going to help us at all points, but airflow, and this is where I talk about pruning with students. If you don't do a proper job in the spring, you're going to see more of this as the season goes on because the rows will get very congested and you're not going to be able to allow that airflow. That sun is going to help you. Okay, so August, September this is when it tends to show up. Anybody know how to deal with this? There's a fun trick that's really easy and is very inexpensive. Milk. It's more than just for us. So powdery mildew and milk. You can use powdered milk, which is less expensive. I use this in tomatoes as well because you deal with blossom end rot. And really it's a combination of fertilizer, turgor pressure, and all sorts of fun stuff that happens within plants as they go on in their days that we have to watch the cell walls. So the reason we use milk in this is it changes the pH. So the fungus does not like milk because it interrupts that cycle. When we get into things like disease triangles, if I knock a corner off a triangle, it's not a triangle anymore, right? So I have to think about how can I interrupt the cycle? This is something I use a lot on squash and pumpkin as well, because you end up covering the leaves. That powdery mildew is like putting sunscreen on your plants that they're not going to get the food that they need, causes them a lot of stress, and this opens up all sorts of issues. If you go through with milk sprayed on your plants, go out in the early morning, just take a water bottle and you soak that plant, it will interrupt that life cycle for the fungus and is going to help reduce it. So give it a couple days, go out every morning, especially on a really sunny day, you can really slow mildew down to the point you almost remove it from the system. So we're creating an environment that it doesn't like, because you can't spray anything on it that's chemical. So I see people walk out and they see me and I'm like, I got milk, and I sprayed it in my mouth so they know that I'm not spraying chemicals, because the second they see something come out, they think, I'm like, no, we can't. So I use this for a lot of plants. It's a very inexpensive, it's safe, anybody can do it, and it's very effective. So if you're dealing with a lot of mildew, powdered milk or milk works great.
Can you use that on any kind of a plant?
Yes, any powdery mildew. So if you have phlox, end of the season, just coat it. Okay, if you have growing squash, you end up getting those awful leaves that are just covered. Just go through, it will disrupt the cycle. It takes a few days and you'll notice that population will start to decrease. The leaves will be more green, it will continue photosynthesizing, and you will have some happier plants that are not struggling, because this is like taking SPS 100 and spraying it onto a plant. It's not going to be able to breathe anymore.
So this is better than like a neem oil.
Yes, neem oil you have to really watch with because it can go into your water system and then it can affect aquatic life. That's why we can't actually buy neem oil in Canada. You need to have a pesticide license to apply it. I have a pesticide license. I choose not to apply it because it causes issues with aquatic life. So if it rinses off your plants, it will eventually find its way to a waterway and it will interrupt life cycles. So this is much more environmentally friendly. It's cheaper, it's safer, and it does really, really work. It sounds like when someone says spray milk on plants, once you interrupt that life cycle of fungus, it will struggle and struggle and it can't repopulate. This will actually slow it down. We deal with a fair amount of rust because we have issues with, again, it was overhead watering. We ended up having a lot of debris when I started. So some of the older varieties, if you're looking at rust lesions, you'll get these orange and it looks like little shots taken out of the leaf that will start to degrade the leaf. It allows for diseases to potentially get into the plant because anytime you create an opening can cause issues. One of the best things to do is if it's raining or it's really damp, just rained early in the morning, put off your garden work until the plants are dry. They are much more susceptible for rust getting into the plants because you're disturbing and possibly damaging the plant. And if it's active in the soil as well, can cause issues. If you have really bad rust, prune it out, burn it, sterilize, and make sure that you are leaving proper airflow. But if you can wait, I know some of us might be retired or have extra time, wait a few hours before you start working. Beans are really bad for this too. Rust in beans is spread by infected tools when it's wet and you're out working. No different in roses. So if you're seeing a lot of rust, try to hold off if it's raining before you go out and work. Give it a few hours before you head out into your gardens. And this is an interesting one because it kind of has a lot of different faces. And we may have seen this and wondered what's happening within our roses. And it's caused by several different things. So we have necrotic green spot. We also have apple mosaic virus. There's a combination of things going on. You cannot get rid of this. If you see any of these leaves, there's some more slides in here that show you all the different wonderful patterns you get. I get people that walk through and go, oh, look at the lovely pattern. I'm like, yes, it's lovely, isn't it? You cannot cure this. There's no amount of pruning, soil health, things you can spray on it. You're not going to get rid of it. How do you get rid of it? You pick virus-free plants. So a lot of growers will guarantee now that the plants are virus-free when you select them. So look for ones that are actually resistant or guaranteed to be resistant. Because really, it appears in the spring, you'll have it all season. There's nothing you can do. It does not look nice. It gives you wonderful different shapes and patterns, but we don't want that, okay? So I see a lot of this one, the oak, and it gives an oak shape. You'll get what looks like a chlorosis in reverse. So chlorosis is usually just green veins and yellow leaves. It looks like someone reversed the pattern. It looks often like micronutrient problems. So when plants have micronutrient issues, they start to flag in their leaves, showing different things that might potentially show up, but this is a virus and it has lots of different faces. And this is what makes it very difficult to tell what it is right away if you're inexperienced, because you might see an interesting pattern and think, oh, maybe I have sulfur issues, or maybe I have, nitrogen issues. So you start pumping the plant full of incorrect things and not actually looking at the key problem. What should you do if you have plants like this? Gone, okay? I have a few beds that I'm dealing with this, but there's no roses to go in their place. So I kind of have to just bite my lip and let them hang out for a little bit longer. They don't spread it to healthy roses. It sits within the bed. So I do have to watch and kind of bite my lip. This is one that is kind of a twofold. We often think it's a virus, but really the virus is spread by mites. And this is why we get curling. The calling card is the crazy amount of thorns you get, right? We've seen this before and wondered where it came from, what happened to my rose. I had a beautiful rose and suddenly it looks like really hairy legs. And you're like, what happened to this plant? So a lot of mites and a lot of pests that we deal with are considered vectors for disease. So when they're feeding, they will regurgitate back into the plant and they will make the plant sick from feeding over and over. And then they'll go to another plant and they'll take that virus, that material, and bring it to the next one and the next one. It'd be very frustrating to deal with because mites are very, very small and you often don't see them. What is the calling card for mites? Anybody know what to look for? Webbing. Okay, so they'll leave webbing behind. I always tell students that really we're like detectives. The plants don't tell us what's wrong. They send flags to us and say, look what I have, look what I have. And you're always trying to figure out and trying to solve. And you're trying to prepare. It spreads throughout the roses, infected roses. This is when you take everything, the roots, the whole thing, bag it and throw it out. Okay, don't even burn it. I just throw this one out into the dumpster. Do not give this back to the earth in any form. Okay, very, very frustrating. If you have wild roses, that you see this a lot more with wild rose stock, you're seeing less and less of it because growers aren't using that as much anymore or not using it at all. If you have wild roses near your garden, you can spread it because the mites will go to the wild roses and they'll carry it into your roses. So be very careful. If you're in an area that has a lot of naturalized areas, kind of take a walk around and see if there's any wild roses. And if you're not familiar with them, they're single flowered. The flower lasts what? A day, maybe a day and a half, and then they fall off. They're very, they're meant for their roots and that's why they use them. They're not exactly the most beautiful plant, but they can be very, very frustrating for us. So we get curling and all sorts of fun things, proper spacing. You can burn them. I end up removing. Our biggest thing is keeping all of our tools clean. If you're working in a bed that has this, rose rosette will easily spread through that sap that gets left on your tools. Some people go as far as sanitizing their gloves as well. I have some students that will put latex gloves over top of their gardening gloves when they're working in each bed, and then we'll trade them out if we're dealing with a lot. So you're kind of like surgeons when you're working in the garden. You want to be careful that we don't spread this. Heavy fall pruning can deter it, slow it down, but you'll never get rid of it. And again, any debris that comes off of these beds, you need to remove it right away. So be very careful. So some of our pest management, again, I will share some different things that we deal with and how we deal with them and some things to look for, because these are our friends that we deal with all the time, our rose aphid. first have to understand when you look at any sort of damage, what kind of damage am I looking at? And where do I find the damage? Because we are said detectives, we're trying to find this. Aphids fall into that piercing, sucking mouth part. So the mouth parts tell us what kind of damage and then allow us to identify the pest. And as we know, there's lots of different aphids, lots and lots of different colors and shapes. They go after certain plants, some of them cross over. Some interesting
Who are you
stuff.
calling? Terry.
Someone's chatting away. It's interesting because they can produce up to 80 young in a week. And that's a lot. One aphid, 80. And then they have this interesting adaptation that they can give birth to live young that are already pregnant. And we also deal with the fact that once the population they will give birth to aphids that have wings, so they can take a show on the road. It's really frustrating. So how do we deal with them? First off, you need to know how they feed, like I said, piercing, sucking. They go after big growth, flowers. They like that hot, dry as well, that summertime heat. And they also have a symbiotic relationship with ants. So if you see a lot of ants around your roses, be vigilant looking because you probably have the start of aphid. And what aphids and ants do is the ants will farm them. So when you see the ants, they will actually follow the aphids around. And when the aphids are done eating, they secrete a honeydew, which is basically like a liquid waste that is sugary, and the ants love it. So they farm them. It sounds kind of mean, but they will actually farm their aphids because it's a food source for them. So they'll take that sugar back to their nests. So if you're seeing plants that have a lot of ants and you have a lot of ants in your garden, look for aphids because they are usually side by side. Okay, so for us, we see them from June to the end of the season. We have to be careful in the type of aphids. Rose aphids only go after roses, but when you're dealing with things like potato aphids, there's a chance that they can go from your vegetables into your poinsettia crop indoors. So we have to be very careful in where you situate your gardens. We control them with high pressure water. Another thing is insecticidal soap. So you can go ahead and purchase insecticidal soap, but you can make your own insecticidal soap that is just effective and works quite well. But we have this wonderful natural predator. We use this in greenhouses and we actively release Clemani, which is this small black little wasp here that will produce aphids that turn gold. And if you've ever looked at aphid populations, and I implore you this summer to look, you'll see gold aphids. And these are parasitized. So this wasp will go around to aphids and will actually inject their young into and the aphid turns gold. So if you see any gold aphids, they turn really round, leave them. They're actually producing this natural predator. So they're naturally out in the environment. We actually get them sent into greenhouses to help control aphids. So we get little strips that every week, we don't use much pesticide at all in our greenhouse because we have a conservatory with butterflies. We have to be very careful. So this wonderful adult wasp will use this as its nursery and it will hatch more of these wonderful wasps. So if you see any gold aphids, do not scrape them off, do not kill them because they're actually harboring this wonderful natural predator and they will turn gold and they'll be quite large compared to the other aphids. So has anyone ever seen gold aphids? No. Okay, so now you're going to go and look this summer and you will see lots of gold aphids because this predator is out there. He is very ferocious and will lay lots of eggs. People think about just ladybugs and ladybugs are going to, destroy the population of aphids. There's a lot of wonderful natural predators that are using them as hosts. So if you see ants, you probably have aphids. If you see gold ones, you have parasitic wasps, which are good, and you want to encourage them. So leave those gold ones behind. How large is the wasp? How large? It's tiny, tiny, tiny. You would have to look very, very closely to see it. It's probably the size of a pencil head when it comes out. So it's very unassuming and it's not an actual pest, it doesn't cause any issues. It is a ferocious egg layer into aphids. So we use these in greenhouses as natural predators because you encourage these natural predators to feed on everything that's in there so we don't have damage and we don't have to use pesticides. So we try to do the same and encourage the same thing outside. Always having a mixed garden around also helps because you'll bring more natural predators in. It's very hard to release natural predators outside, because what will happen when their food source dwindles? They're gone. Okay, so we have to make sure that they have a food source. That's why they're easier in greenhouses, but these are naturally occurring outside. So this summer you have a task. You're going to look for your gold aphids. What you can also do, and I'm not promoting any brand, so there we go. Put a little label over it, is you can make your own. It's just as effective as buying the expensive stuff. You can buy any brand of yellow soap, 1 teaspoon into a liter, and it's 0.26 gallons for you guys. Put it in a spray bottle and saturate those aphids. Does anybody know what soap does to an aphid?
What is it?
It clogs up their spiracles, so where they breathe, they can't breathe, so they basically drown. It's an environmentally friendly way of removing them is soap, and it will just dissipate back into the environment, lemon soap. And if you have turf around, it will also help. So any brand lemon soap, don't buy the apple scented or any fun scents, just get your plain old lemon, and it works amazing. And it will cost you pennies to do compared to what we do. So if we have a big population of aphids, I'll go through and give it a quick blast of water to disrupt them, can cause them stress. Then they will, either dissipate or stop breeding because I've caused them stress. Go through with a bit of soap, you can get rid of them pretty fast. So like I say, stop buying it, start making it, not hard to do. We deal with a fair amount of spider mites when we have hot, dry summers. Spider mites affect a lot of plants. They do like roses. We like to have biodiversity. This is why we're adding a lot more perennials so we can host some natural predators. But their calling card is webbing. The most common one that you see is the 2-spotted spider mite. Whether you work indoors or outdoors, you're going to see this one. Very, very tiny. The webbing will cover a whole leaf, and they cause what's called stippling, meaning that they have a piercing, sucking mouth part again, and they will pierce into the plant what looks like needles. So it gets kind of that gray mottled look. It just doesn't look as shiny. The leaf looks stressed because they're constantly feeding. They dislike high humidity. They love your indoor environment. This is why when you bring your ivy in or your rosemary at the end of the summer, they just get covered in spider mites because your house is so dry compared to outside. So your best bet, if you're seeing this in a small scale, is to go through. You can use insecticidal soap, but just a mist of water every morning onto that population, you'll end up killing them. They like hot and dry. Any moisture is going to take them out. So go through, give them a little mist. This is where a spray bottle works great. I'll go through and just walk through the gardens, and any populations, I'll just give a little squirt in the morning and make sure that I can take care of. Again, cheap, easy. Okay. Anybody has roses? Who has Japanese beetles? Right. What's that? Oh,
Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't.
yeah. So they run on 7-year cycles. A lot of insects have cycles where they produce more, and more offspring are sometimes produced by weather conditions or stress. Things will often end up overpopulating, so they don't have a food source, so you'll end up losing a population. People in vineyards, I live in an area where there's a lot of vineyards, they put roses at the end of their rows as indicator plants. So they know when the Japanese beetles are going to be coming. They have wonderful chewing mouth parts, so they do this wonderful skeletonizing. So we don't have photosynthesizing, the plants become stressed, and they are an absolute pain in the butt to deal with. So since we can't spray, what we have to do is we go through and we do a lot of hand picking. So I say students who come in late, no, I'm joking. They have to go out, take soapy water. If you have roses that are starting to show this, they like that hot afternoon sun. They'll come out and reproduce and make more. Great fun. But if you go too early to go grab them, they will, as soon as you cast a shadow, and on the next picture we'll show you, they actually put their second set of legs, which are right here. And they do this cool maneuver. They stick their arms up and then they fall off the leaf, and then you can't grab them. So one thing I learned from them is don't create a shadow, because as soon as they see your shadow, arms go up, they're gone. So if you actually just put the bucket underneath and just go into the water, that soapy water will take them out. And I don't like to grab them with my hand because I find they burrow. And there's something about things that burrow into your hand. You're like, oh, no. Students always tease me. I don't like things that have that skin texture, any caterpillars that feel like skin, or Japanese beetles because they burrow into your hands. But just take them and swipe them off. If you go out early morning and into the evening, they're usually busy producing and not thinking about you, and you can come and reduce the population. They're only here for a short amount of time in the way of damage. We see most damage in May, and where do they go after that? Lay eggs in our soil and cause C-shaped grubs that destroy our turf, and that's why you get skunks and all of the ripped up grass is their cycle. So they are a C-shaped grub. If you're working in your garden and you see any white C-shaped grubs in the spring, what should you do? Chop them up, okay? Because they are the ones causing this fun. Okay, so we deal with them, and this is one just about ready to do its chuck and roll. It will put its arms up. I've been observing them. I was kind of curious what they do. And just like a fish, when you lean over top of them, they freeze for a second and then they're gone. So the same thing with Japanese beetles. If they see your shadow, it will promote them to duck and cover. So if you can kind of sneak up on them, it's your best bet to get rid of them. And we literally walk through the gardens with buckets of soapy water and start pulling them off. Last year wasn't as bad. The year before was really, really bad. So we had to go through on a regular basis, and we had a resurgence in August that they came back. But usually we only get one bout, and it's usually the spring. So a question I often get is a trap dilemma, right? So I find it interesting because yes, it works with pheromones, so it's natural. So basically I say it's creating like a teenage house party. All the beetles come together, right? And to create more beetles. But the scent brings all the beetles to where the bag is. So I often see this, people put them indoors, and I'm like, welcome to my bag of dead beetles. Or they put them in the middle of their roses because they think they're doing their roses a favor. We have used them on our site. We put them on outlying areas to try draw them away. I always say, let your neighbors buy them and put them in their garden because they're not as cost effective as you think, the bags. They can be a nuisance. They stink in a couple days, so you have to clean them regularly. I have done it with bottles, and I've actually taken that and put it onto a bottle that they fall into the bottle, and then I can change it easier because the bag is cumbersome and it creates waste. So I kind of repurposed a plastic bottle, and I was able to make it a little more environmentally friendly to use it. But in a lot of ways, the issue is you're bringing all of the beetles in an area. And I actually sat there and watched the one time, and it was just thousands of them. And it was so gross. I'm like, I'm just going to stand over here while these beetles come together and do their thing, but I do not want them on my roses. So it's a dilemma that people have because it's marketed to them. Buy it, buy it, buy it. If you're vigilant and just go through every morning and evening for a few weeks, you can reduce that population quite a bit without having to reduce yourself to Japanese beetle party in your backyard because it can be really frustrating. They go on everything once they get into your backyard in these numbers, so it's not worth doing the damage. We deal with a lot of thrips as flower growers. If you look into the center of flowers, you'll notice these wonderful little insects sliding around in your roses. If you go out in the early morning, you tend to see them. Again, they're piercing and sucking, but they're really, really small. So they're about the size of a staple. And Western flower thrips are our biggest problem in our greenhouses and in our outdoor gardens because they cause distortion, they cause silvering. If you have grass around your roses, you really need to make sure that you keep the grass cut. Don't let your grass get above 3.5 inches because that creates an environment that they love. So make sure if your rose beds, we cut our grass in the summer months, sometimes 2 times a week in the rose garden. Right now, I said I was going to turn goats out there because the grass was crazy after last week. And we had to go through and cut today. And the amount of grass that was having to be cut back in some spots was up to 4 inches of grass that grew in a matter of days. So that harbors a lot of these. We want to make sure that we are removing any flowers that are just filled. So if you walk through your roses, take a quick look, give them a little shake. An interesting tool to have is an eye loop because you can see an ID. We also use sticky traps. Using yellow sticky cards allows you to look at populations in your garden and see what's actually accumulating. So you can kind of keep tabs. Again, insecticidal soap, you can drench your plants if you're seeing a lot. If you're seeing a lot within the flowers, give them a prune and just let the rose kind of take a break because you can interrupt the populations that way. Question?
What about find nematodes?
So nematodes are for your C-shaped grubs. They have limited use because they're not very mobile. So they do not move a lot of times if there's not enough moisture. So you have to turn irrigation on. They're very photosynthetic. So when you're actually applying them, you have to be careful that it's overcast, mixing the tank. And if you have screens on your tank, they will all try to leave when you spray at the same time, and they'll all get stuck in the screen. So they're microscopic, but they're all trying to leave the room at the same time. Can be problems. So you have to make sure that your screens are limited in size so they can actually exit the tank and you can use them. Limited use because of moisture. They do not move if it's not moist. So they basically have to fall onto that grub for something to happen because they're not mobile in the soil unless your water is saturating that ground and you're creating a waterfall underneath. So limited use. Okay. Okay, so the last one I'll talk about is rose midge. We had 1 year, I guess, there was no roses.
Yeah,
Absolutely
this
no
is all
roses.
stuff I know. This
And
is,
rose
I
midge,
thought it
the
was gonna be
struggling
something
thing with
different.
rose midge is that it will go through, and you can see here, it looks like someone burnt the bud. And it just looks like it's about to form, and then it will just start to flop and it will blacken. It looks like someone took a little torch.
yeah, you know what, that's good. And then I'll do the meatloaf
It can be
Friday.
really frustrating.
It is easy
because
for you to do
It's
it.
always right
No, I don't
before
want that. I want the roaster, chicken
that
roaster.
this really starts to
Oven
show.
stuff, there's an
How it
oven
really
stuffer in there.
A preamble that all
There's
the
a-
shoots
Put in oven
And what
stuffer
happens
roaster.
is that it will lay eggs in
No,
the
it's not
soil.
frozen.
Around the base of the rose, it will lay eggs and then it will crawl up the
Make
rose.
it for
and
tomorrow.
get
There's
into
stuffing in the
those bugs
cabinet.
and bugs
And
down.
look, I don't know.
So one
where
of your
the butter
best
is.
things
The
to
butter
do
might be
is
freezing.
regularly cultivate around your roses, not digging that you're digging into the roots. But if you cultivate and disturb the soil, you're adding oxygen, you're creating more of a composting environment that will help break down this. Also, something else people suggest is if you do have bird feeders, if you can put them closer to your roses, it can help with pests as well. We don't have bird feeders. We do have a lot of hawks, so we have to be careful with that on our site. We don't want to cause any issues, but cultivating around the base works really well. Something else that I've worked with is molasses. So using unsulfured molasses, so an organic molasses, you're using 1 tablespoon in a liter of water, 0.26 gallons, and drenching the plant. The molasses will actually create a surface that they don't like, and they won't go and feed. And molasses doesn't damage your plants, it's inexpensive, and again, it's environmentally friendly, so anybody can purchase and use it, no PPE required. So a mix of going through and cultivating your rose beds will really help break the cycle of that insect because it is laying in the ground and it's just waiting to basically pupate and make its way back up in the rose and become this wonderful wasp that's causing issues. So molasses and cultivating is our best bet. So we regularly cultivate our beds. We're looking at removing weeds and it will help us with rose midge. We haven't had issues for years with rose midge, so cross your fingers that we're on the right path to make sure that our soil health is really helping us. I always say no soil, no plants. So we have our last little friend of sawfly. This is chewing damage. These ones are considered more of a nuisance. We don't see a lot of them. We have the occasional plant that shows up. You can go through and hand pick. So part of IPM is taking a look at your plants and seeing any damage. Like I say, they leave their calling cards. Again, this is where bird feeders can help to attract natural predators. The issue is they are green, they look like the leaf, it's often hard to see them, so you start to see damage, and that's when you start looking for them. Okay, so we don't see a lot of them. I have friends that deal with this on a regular basis, you know, half an hour away from us. We only see a handful that appear in a season. So for us, they're considered more of a nuisance and how we go through and take a look. So some of the resources that I go through and use, because I have to, everything that goes through that I have to go through a whole channel of people to get things approved. So I have to look at, is this worth putting in our gardens? Is it going to help us out? And one of the biggest resources I do use is Help Me Find, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. It allows you to look at back breeding of roses, all the trade names for it, so you can see all the different ways it's gone through. And it's very effectual because people can actually comment as well on the quality of rose in different parts of the country. We don't get many from Canada that make comments, so it's mainly the US, but allows us to see how they perform. And then I go through and do a lot of cross-referencing. I can share this PowerPoint so you guys can have all the resources. You're more than, there's no caramel secret here, don't worry. So one of our growers that we work with is JC Backer, which is, like I said, one of the largest rose producers in Canada, which is located a short distance from us in St. Catharines. Anytime that you end up purchasing roses in Canada, at just about any store, any garden center, they come from JC Backer. So they are a family business, really interesting, massive production. It's strange because the city of St. Catharines grew, and he has all these fields that are basically in people's backyards. So he'll have an acre here and an acre there. It's not like a place that has, 200 acres all in one shot. When you go for tours there, you're literally driving through people's backyards. But massive coolers, they do all bare root. We purchase a lot of material through them. I taught 3 of his sons over the years. So I said, it's kind of a family business. Every time I go there, I'm like, hey, more backers.
Excuse me.
Hello.
Hello?
Ontario does have a trial garden.
Yes, I want to ask you a question. Could I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Does JC Backer ship to the United States?
They may ship to garden centers. They are a wholesale operation. But you can contact them to ask what garden centers, because they do ship into the US as well, to see where they go to. They within Canada, they supply Costco and Home Depot for all of their roses. So they may be doing the same thing within the States as well. They do have a little gold medallion in all their tags that say JC Backer. So if you are out looking, a lot of them probably coming across the border from us.
Okay,
So don't
thank you.
hesitate to reach out to them.
All right, thank you.
No problem. Landscape Ontario is our governing body for all landscape trades within Ontario. And they actually have a trial garden, and their gentleman that runs the trial garden, Roger, he actually works for the University of Guelph, and we share a lot of data back and forth. And he has a trial garden of just roses. So you can go take a look, which is located in Milton, Ontario. It's open to the public. I can give you his contact information. I'm sure you'd be welcome to people to take a look. And we've gone back and forth quite a few times on cultivars and how we go through. We also have RBG, so Royal Botanical Gardens. If you haven't been, I say plan a day that you can head in that direction, go up to Burlington and check out what they do there. I do work with them regularly because we deal with the same thing with the fact that we cannot use pesticides. They're in the same boat. They actually had a year that they had no flowers, and I got the panicked phone call from their director. What are you doing that you have flowers? We have no flowers. And they were dealing with rose midge really, really bad, and they had nothing. Like, he showed me pictures and I was like, oh my. And people are paying a lot to come see shrubs with no roses. So he went through a lot of scary stuff. And we worked on a couple items and were able to get back on track again. You've heard of Palatine roses. They are on the smaller side for production. So you might notice when you order, like if you're ordering more than 10 roses, sometimes it's really hard. So for us, our average beds start at 35 roses. It's hard for us to order from Palatine because they only produce a small amount of roses. So we tend to go towards JC Backer because we can get quantities of 50 and 60 roses brought in at once without having to kind of piecemeal it together. It makes it a little bit more challenging. For resources, I also look at David Austin. I know David Austin roses kind of fell on the wayside for a while in the way of breeding, and they weren't trendy anymore, and they are really coming back with a lot of interesting and new varieties. So really worth taking a look at, especially some of their climbers are absolutely amazing. So I do use a lot of these resources. Like I said, I do keep data. If you have questions about cultivars, how do they perform? I've got spreadsheets that could put you to sleep for days. They're even color coded. So I get really excited about that stuff. But I enjoy collecting data, having a research background. It's nice to see how they perform. And we actually do an overall rating, and I can go back and actually look at the weather as well, because the weather helps dictate. If we had a really rainy year, I'm expecting that my numbers are going to be higher. On drier years, yes, they're naturally going to be lower. So I have to take everything with a grain of salt. If I just say, oh, look, my black spot rating's amazing, and do this with the weather, I know that I'm not doing myself a proper. So I have to look at weather. There's a lot that goes into it, but understand that we struggle since we just can't go to a store and buy a pesticide and be able to apply it. We constantly have to think about, what are we doing with our plants? How can we improve their environment? How can we improve their health? The bonus for us not using chemicals in that respect, it allows us to have the gardens open all the time. We have very few times that we have to go through and close things. We do spray horticultural vinegar on our pathways. It does get very expensive, so we often are just line trimming it. So we have very few slow down days for people. It also makes it much safer for us as staff. Like I said, I have a pesticide license, but I don't actually spray because I can't use chemicals, which is kind of weird that I have to have it, but it's part of the licensing that I need. And it's nice because I know that I can touch the plants and I'm not going to be touching things that might potentially make me sick or anybody else who's coming onto the site. So I think about environmental responsibility for us, and it's kind of nice that we can showcase and show that we still have roses. We have beautiful roses, as you know from the people that came from tours. Don't believe the lies, there's lots of roses and they look quite nice. And things just keep getting nicer because we're adding a lot of new varieties that are doing quite well for disease resistant. A lot of the Pompanella Fairy Tale series, the Fairy Tale series has been fantastic. I added a few new varieties and I was absolutely thrilled with how they performed. I always kind of rate performance too when I watch people go into the garden. They kind of gravitate towards certain beds, and that's when all the cameras come out and people take the pictures. And certain beds bring more people out because they use them as a backdrop for photographs. And I can tell you that some of our new varieties are, they're hot biting. I have to tell them, please don't stand in the beds. I know it sounds like fun, but we have to stand on the outside. So I'd like to end and say thank you for having me. I hope that you guys enjoyed, learned a little, understood that there's a lot of different tools that we have. We don't always have to reach for something that might be caustic. It's a fast answer. It's a blanket solution, and it's not a long-term solution. So if we want to keep ourselves healthy, the environment healthy, and what we grow, we really have to think about how we manage our plants. And like I said, if you have questions, please, please, please feel free, send me an email and I will share this. The font kind of, I think your PowerPoints might be a little bit older than mine. The font's a little bit different. That's why it transitioned. You are welcome to come visit our site 365 days a year. I may not be there. I'm there Monday to Friday through the summer months, 7 to 3:30. And you're welcome. Please send me a message and say you're coming, and I will do my best to make sure that I can guide you. If you guys want to set up a tour for the summer, you're more than welcome to come join us. Our prime time, of course, is Father's Day weekend. Depending this year, it might be a little bit earlier. And then our second flush is end of August into the beginning of September. We do a summer prune in July to do a little bit of rejuvenation. We don't want the plants to think about seeding. If they're thinking about reproduction, they're wasting their energy a little bit differently. We want them to go back to a second flush. And we've been pretty successful to get a really nice fall show as well. So like I said, if you have questions, I know the second I leave, somebody like, I wanted to ask that and I forgot. So don't hesitate. Students always laugh. They're like, I send you an email and you actually respond. I love messages. I love people who send me messages. I love to answer questions, and I really love to be able to share what I've learned and my experiences. Because like I said, it's not all been sunshine and roses. There's been some tears, some gray hair, as you can tell. And it's part of life. I said I earned my stripes. But it was a pleasure to come talk to you guys about what we do. And don't be strangers. Please come and join us, because there's a lot that the parks can offer in the way of enjoying the outdoors. It's not just roses. We have lots of wonderful gardens, but please come see our rose garden. It's really worth a visit.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you.
Very nice people.
I'm proud I didn't cough because I have really
You
bad
need to take a
asthma.
break. Yeah.
I have really bad asthma, and I'm proud of myself that I didn't start coughing.
I'm going to pause or stop the recording, but if there are any questions, we'll take a couple questions and we'll take a break.
Any questions? I love questions.
What did you say would be like maybe your top 2 or 3 roses that you found are good for disease resistance, winter hardiness.
Definitely Poseidon.
Poseidon.
Thank you, guys.
Is hands down, usually purple's a weak color, but hands down, that is, if we had Neptune and